He walked into the cafe unnoticed, like a shadow slipping through daylight. No polished suit, no aura of power, just a man quiet, asking for a cup of coffee. The waitress looked at him once, her eyes like shards of glass. Her voice cracked the air. "If you don't have a tip, don't waste my time." The words cut deeper than steel, humiliating in their cold finality. Silence spread heavy, suffocating. He did not answer. His hand rested on the table steady, but the weight of that moment pressed into him. One trembling hand will soon slip something into his, and from that secret nothing will ever be the same. A seed is planted in rage and shock, in the raw ache of being dismissed. The story begins not in calm, but in collision. He sat in the farthest corner where shadows softened the light. To the room, he was nothing, a stranger in a worn jacket, a man without weight. But behind the lowered gaze was Jackson, the figure who carried entire ledgers of profit and loss on his shoulders. Power, now tucked beneath thrift store fabric authority, folded into silence. He let the coffee steam drift upward, the warmth against his hand, a quiet anchor. I want to see the truth. No report can hold his thought pressed inward, heavy and solemn. That truth lived not in polished graphs, but in the raw exchange between worker and customer, in voices frayed by fatigue. His hand rested flat calm on the table, but beneath the skin a pulse beat with purpose. No one in that room could guess that the man who appeared so ordinary had once commanded silence in boardrooms with a single look. Tonight he wanted no deference. He wanted honesty stripped bare, the kind that bruises. Maribel strode past with a tray, the weight dragging her arm low. She set the cup down with a slam that rattled the saucer. No smile, no courtesy, just the scrape of ceramic against wood. Her brows locked into a hard line as she muttered, "Wait." A young man at the next table frowned, half rising to protest. Before his words could shape, she cut him with a hiss. "You got a problem." Her tone had no room for reply. The cafe fell quiet, an air thick with embarrassment, irritation, unease. The steam curled upward unacknowledged, as if even the drink wanted to vanish. Jackson's eyes did not flinch. He measured her without judgment, but the silence around him grew heavier, as though every patron carried the weight of her disdain. In her presence, the room itself seemed brittle on edge, one strike away from fracture. He made no move, not yet. His stillness was sharper than words, his calm hand against the table a contrast to her fury. Her back turned, the tray balanced against her hip. Maribel pulled a phone from her apron. The screen lit her tired face in pale blue. Her voice dropped to a whisper, frayed at the edges. "Silas, take your medicine. Mama will be home soon." The name slipped into the air, fragile and unfamiliar, the first glimpse of something hidden. A moment before, she had been a storm-sharp, unyielding. Now her shoulders sagged as though the bones themselves carried too much. The contrast cut deeper than cruelty. It revealed the fracture beneath the mask. She pressed the phone, tight eyes closing against a silence that answered back. Jackson shifted slightly, his gaze sharpening. The name lingered with him, echoing in the hollow between sips of coffee. Silas. A child, unseen, already shaping the story. Maribel straightened, forced the scowl back onto her face, and turned once more toward the tables. But the mask no longer fooled him. The hardness was not natural. It was survival. Eldon raised his cup with both hands, the porcelain trembling slightly as he sipped. His eyes were pale with years, his voice low enough to brush the rim of secrecy. She was kind once. Gentle. Now, only a shadow remains. The words did not accuse. They mourned. His gaze lingered on Maribel as though recalling a version of her long buried beneath exhaustion. Jackson inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgement. No words escaped him, only a silence weighted heavier than speech. Eldon sighed, the kind of sigh that carried decades of disappointments, and set his cup down with care. His look held both pity and distance, the recognition of a soul frayed beyond repair. In that moment, the air around Maribel seemed to thicken. She was no longer merely rude or careless. She was a ruin, glimpsed in daylight, a figure who carried within her the echo of something once whole. Jackson felt it press against him, a question without answer, an ache without voice. Maribel returned with another tray, the weight pulling her steps uneven. The cups rattled faintly, a tremor that betrayed more than clumsiness. She moved past the tables, but her eyes flicked sideways toward a figure at the far end. Dorian, his name whispered among staff, sat half-hidden, his posture, still his stare sharp enough to wound. He had not spoken yet, had not moved. yet the presence was suffocating. Maribel's jaw tightened. Her glance was quick, furtive, as though fearing he might rise at any second. The mask of anger she wore for customers seemed thin compared to the dread etched in her glance toward him. Jackson followed the line of her vision, seeing not just fatigue, but fear carved deep as scars. The tray landed with a muted thud, her hands unsteady, her breath caught between obedience and defiance. The shadow of Dorian had entered the room without a word, turning silence into a threat. Jackson murmured under his breath a thought carried no further than the rim of his cup. Every mask cracks eventually. Across the room, Maribel forced a smile, brittle, unnatural. She bent toward a customer, lips curving upward in the semblance of service, but the expression died as quickly as it appeared. Her eyes betrayed her hollow, weary, a woman carrying a role that no longer fit. The tray shifted in her hands, her shoulders bent under invisible weight. Each gesture screamed performance, each glance begged not to be seen. To those watching casually, she was rude, incompetent, hardened. To Jackson, she was an actress in chains waiting for the costume to collapse. And it would. The mask could not hold forever. The strain in her features was already tearing at the seams. What lay beneath would not remain hidden for long. The fall was inevitable, and it would drag them all into its wake. Jackson raised his eyes only slightly, his tone even. "More sugar, please." Maribel returned without pause, dropped the packet on the table with a sharp flick, no glance, no thank you. The paper skidded against the wood, a sound small, yet cutting. A young man at the next table shifted his frown, clear, his shoulders stiff with offense. He watched her walk away, muttering under his breath. The cafe's air thickened again, every small gesture carrying weight it did not deserve. Jackson remained still, his silence deliberate, his eyes fixed not on her face but on her hand, the way it trembled after the slam, the way she clenched it quickly into a fist as though to hide the betrayal of nerves. She had delivered the insult, but she had also revealed the crack. The hand that struck out was not steady, it was shaking under strain. Jackson felt the truth press closer, disguised inside contempt. Rage rose in the room, but beneath it was another story, one no one else cared to see. The sound of footsteps broke the simmering quiet. Dorian emerged at last, his presence heavy, deliberate. His voice cracked like iron against stone. "If you can't make them order more, I'll find someone who can." Each word landed like a hammer. Maribel lowered her head, the fight draining out of her posture. Her hands curled tight, the knuckles pale, but no protest came. The room held its breath. The customers watched uneasy, not for sympathy, but for the chill his command carried. Jackson's gaze sharpened, tracing the exchange with precision. It was not merely harshness, it was domination. Dorian's eyes swept the tables as if ownership extended beyond employees to everyone present. Authority without restraint, cruelty without mask. Maribel stood bent under it, silent, a vessel of forced obedience. The atmosphere thickened, oxygen thinning until even the clink of cups felt intrusive. The tyrant had stepped from shadow into light, and with him the reason for her mask. A man at the counter asked for a latte. Minutes later, Maribel set down a cappuccino instead, foam spilling at the rim. The customer frowned, confusion turning sharp. "This isn't what I ordered." Her reply was blunt, uncaring. "Drink it or leave it." His chair scraped back, anger thick in his voice. He left the untouched cup cooling into waste. From across the room, Dorian's gaze lingered, lips curving in grim satisfaction. His nod was not rebuke, but approval. Jackson saw it, the silent instruction beneath the exchange. This was no accident, no incompetence. The mistake had been staged, the rudeness rehearsed. Maribel was not free to serve correctly. She was compelled to sabotage, to inflame. Jackson's thoughts darkened. The cruelty was systemic, not personal. Every insult carried the weight of someone else's demand. What looked like neglect was in truth a strategy, and the victim was both the customer who walked away and the woman forced to wear this poisoned role. Eldon lifted his cup, voice mild as he asked for hot water. It was the smallest request, the kind any server could grant with ease. Maribel's reply struck like a lash. "Can't you see? I'm busy." The words cracked across the table, sharp and unforgiving. Eldon did not argue. He lowered his eyes, gave a slow nod, and sipped what remained in silence. The lines on his face deepened not in anger, but in quiet sorrow. His gaze carried memory, the ache of someone who had once been treated with dignity, now met with scorn. Jackson's hand tightened around his cup porcelain, pressing into skin. A pulse beat heavy in his temple, rhythm quickening. The insult was more than rude service. It was cruelty aimed at weakness at age. Yet beneath the bite in her voice he saw the tremor in her hand, the mask slipping for half a breath. Rage rose in him, paired with a reluctant pity. She played the villain, but her eyes betrayed a prisoner. Clive rose abruptly, chair legs scraping his fingers, stabbing the air toward Maribel. She's stealing tips. I left $5, only one remains. Murmurs broke among the tables, a ripple of suspicion spreading like fire. Dorian stepped forward, slow, deliberate, shaking his head as though burdened by disappointment. Unbelievable, he muttered, his tone heavy with false sorrow. Maribel froze. Her lips parted, but no defense came. The tray in her hands trembled, her knuckles drained of color. She stood locked in silence, shoulders drawn tight against the blow. The crowd stirred, whispers circling, eyes narrowing with judgment. Jackson's stare hardened, his features cut in shadow. He saw the trembling, the fear buried under defiance. She was guilty of something, but not this. The air thickened, each heartbeat louder than words. Clive's accusation clung to the room, untested, unproven, yet already believed. Dorian let it linger, fanning the fire, enjoying the spectacle of shame. Dorian's voice cracked the silence like a whip. See? Even the customers say it. If you can't bring in tips, you're done here. His eyes drilled into Maribel, merciless. She nodded once her mouth pressed into a line, swallowing words she dared not speak. Her hand clenched at her apron, trembling, twisting the fabric until her knuckles ached. It was not the grip of a thief clutching stolen money, but of a captive chained to survival. Around them, the cafe grew quieter, as though complicit in her humiliation. Jackson drew a long breath, holding back the fire rising in his chest. He had heard enough to know this was not negligence, not arrogance alone. It was subjugation, sharpened into ritual. Dorian stood tall, satisfied, his command unchallenged. Maribel stood smaller, diminished, shrinking into herself. The spectacle was not service, it was punishment made public. And in that punishment, Jackson saw the fracture widen. Chairs scraped back as customers left one after another, their frustration hanging in the air like smoke. Cups of coffee cooled untouched steam, long-vanished silence settling where conversation should have been. The cafe, once a place of warmth, had soured into something hollow. Maribel moved between tables without spark, her figure diminished, drifting like a shadow that had lost its owner. Her eyes no longer met those she served. Her motions carried only the weight of endurance. At the far corner, Dorian reclined with satisfaction, a faint curl at his lips. His fingers shuffled through bills, counting slowly, savoring each note as if every dollar were proof of victory. The contrast sharpened the room. Where others suffered loss, he harvested gain. Patrons who remained sensed it, a corruption woven into every exchange, a system that drained dignity for profit. In that space, injustice was no longer hidden. It was the air itself, pressing on every chest. Yet, even as the room suffocated, something darker still gathered beyond the surface. The worst had not yet arrived, and the silence, heavy and expectant, waited for its break. Jackson raised his hand once more, his voice calm but clear, ordering a drink so layered it would strain the barista's patience. The request was not cruel, but deliberate, a probe into the cracks he had already seen. Maribel's eyes narrowed, the tray at her side, rattling. She leaned closer, voice dripping with scorn. "What do you think this is your home?" The words hung heavy, echoing off the silence that fell over the cafe. Chairs stilled, breaths caught. Eldon coughed, the sound sharp in the stillness, a frail body choking on tension too thick to breathe. All eyes shifted between them, the disguised master and the weary servant now locked in open collision. Jackson's lips curved into the faintest smile, not amusement, but recognition. The confrontation had reached its crest. He had pressed, and she had broken character. For a moment he saw the fury was not aimed at him, but at the weight she carried. Yet the mask still held fragile but intact. He sipped his cooling coffee as though accepting her challenge, the game tightening around them both. When the hour for payment came, the room seemed to still waiting for the exchange. Maribel approached her footsteps, measured, her eyes lowered, no longer sharp with hostility. She set the bill upon the table, her hand trembling as it lingered too long. Then, with a motion, quick yet deliberate, she slipped a folded piece of paper into Jackson's palm. Her fingers brushed his briefly, the contact faint, but charged her hand colder than it should have been. The paper was small, crumpled from being hidden too long, the ink pressing faintly through its creases. She turned away before he could react, her shoulders stiff, her mask hastily restored. The cafe remained unaware, patrons sipping, murmuring blind to the secret just exchanged. Jackson's hand closed around the note, the texture of desperation caught in his grip. A secret had been passed, a message sealed not in speech, but in touch. In that fragile moment, power shifted from public humiliation to private confession. A life now pressed itself into his hand. Jackson sat motionless, the folded paper clenched between his fingers. The tremor he had felt in her touch lingered, a vibration of fear etched into his skin. Slowly, he opened it. The handwriting stumbled across the page, letters, uneven words collapsing under haste. "I'm sorry. I'm not like this. The manager forces me. My son needs medicine. If I lose this job, I lose everything." Each sentence carved deeper than the last, not ink but knives against the reader's chest. He read them once, then again, the weight doubling each time. The room around him blurred into silence, the crowd's murmurs erased by the raw voice of desperation scrawled on paper. The image of Maribel shifted violently from tormentor to victim, from villain to mother, clinging to survival. Jackson's chest tightened not with anger alone, but with pity that tasted like ash. Across the room she stood rigid, her eyes downcast, her lashes wet as if daring him not to believe. The story had cracked wide open, and the truth, fragile and merciless, sat trembling in his hand. Jackson did not move. The paper clung to his palm, damp with sweat edges softening under the heat of his grip. His chest rose with slow, deliberate breaths as though every inhale had to carve its way through stone. His eyes lifted toward Maribel. She stood apart, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed nowhere. Yet her eyes, when they met his for an instant, carried the weight of defeat, hollow, pleading, stripped bare. He knew then the mask was gone. What remained was not anger, not insolence, but desperation, raw as an open wound. His fingers tightened over the words she had written, the confession pressed into skin. The truth, he thought, often slips through the narrowest cracks, hidden in fleeting gestures passed hand to hand when no one is watching. He rose without a word, the chair scraping softly against the floor. With measured steps he headed toward the door. To everyone else he appeared ready to leave, but the paper in his hand anchored him to the room, tethering him to what was about to break. At the threshold he stopped. The cafe hummed faintly behind him, but one voice cut through, rich with cruel delight. Dorian spoke, his words dripping arrogance. "The more miserable the customers are, the more they tip. And that money belongs to me." The tone was triumphant, confident in its secrecy, unaware of the ears it reached. Maeve, standing near the counter, dropped her gaze to the floor, shoulders hunched, trembling. She did not protest. Silence was her shield. Jackson turned slowly, eyes narrowing, fire kindling behind the calm mask. The words seared into him, confirmation of what the note had revealed. This was no mere failure of attitude. It was design. It was corruption turned into policy. The villain had unmasked himself not with slip or stumble, but with pride. Jackson's jaw tightened as the reality settled. Maribel was not alone in chains. Every hand in this place was bound to his cruelty. Dorian laughed, the sound raw, echoing against walls that seemed to shrink around it. "These hands are nothing but tools," he sneered. "They exist for one purpose, to funnel money into mine." His words clung to the air venom masquerading as truth. Maeve's shoulders shook, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she wiped them away with quick, furtive gestures. Across the room, Maribel froze, her face draining of color as the reality she had hidden in writing was spoken aloud for all to hear. The air turned colder, oppressive, as though the room itself recoiled from the cruelty. Jackson's hand curled into a fist, the note still inside paper, crumpling under the force of his grip. Anger surged through him, no longer abstract, no longer restrained. He saw not just a corrupt manager, but a system rotting from the top down, crushing those beneath it. The masquerade was finished. The evidence had spoken. Now, rage demanded answer. The weight of the note pressed against his skin, each word seared like fire. The picture was no longer blurred. The hands that had once served bitterness, that had drawn contempt, were not villains, they were captives. Every insult delivered had been extracted under command, a survival act twisted into cruelty. The true hand soaked in guilt belonged to the man who laughed in the shadows, boasting of misery as profit. The roles inverted in a single breath, the one despised became the victim, and the one unseen revealed himself as the author of corruption. Maribel's shoulders shook, her eyes spilling silent grief that no mask could hide now. Her tears were not for herself alone, but for the son she feared to lose. Jackson exhaled heavily, the sound of weariness and decision. The room trembled with anticipation as though every table, every silent witness awaited the final turn. The stage was set for revelation. Jackson turned back into the cafe. The note was still clenched in his fist, but his eyes carried something sharper than paper resolve. He stepped into the center, lifted his hand, and slid the glasses from his face. The room stilled, the scrape of spoons, the shuffle of feet, all collapsing into silence. His voice cut through, deep, commanding, undeniable. "I am not just a customer. I am Jackson." The name fell like thunder, each syllable splitting the air. A man they thought was ordinary now stood unveiled as the one who owned these walls, who wrote their wages, who held the power to unmake the tyrant among them. The cafe froze, disbelief chaining every breath. The mask had fallen, and in its place authority surged, quiet, certain, immovable. The moment cracked the air, the long climb of tension breaking into release. Dorian's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Sweat gathered at his temples, his arrogance drained in an instant. Maribel's lips parted, her face streaked with tears, disbelief mingling with fragile hope. Maeve lifted her head at last, her eyes wide, trembling, yet carrying the first spark of courage. Eldon straightened against his cane knuckles, white, his gaze alive with vindication. Around them, the cafe thickened with silence, not of comfort, but of awe, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to witness. Every patron felt the weight of the name, the shift in power, the unraveling of lies. Jackson stood unmoved, the storm of revelation around him. The air grew heavy, expectant, waiting for judgment to fall. Jackson's voice cut through the heavy silence, measured yet unyielding. "Today, I have seen enough. These hands do not deserve humiliation." His words carried the weight of judgment, the final strike after hours of quiet observation. He lifted his arm, the gesture sharp, and pointed directly at Dorian. The room turned with him, every eye fixing on the man who had thrived on fear. Dorian's lips trembled, the bravado gone. I only followed the company's way," he stammered, sweat glistening on his brow. Jackson's jaw tightened, his gaze like iron. "Wrong. The company will change. Starting now." His tone left no space for negotiation, no echo of compromise. The cafe seemed to shift into a courtroom, its walls bearing witness to the trial. Every patron felt the verdict already hanging in the air. The balance of power tilted sharply. No longer hidden, no longer disguised authority had spoken, and the tyrant stood exposed. The silence was not emptiness, but sentence. The weight of truth pressing down on Dorian, stripping him bare in front of those he had once commanded. The dam broke. Maribel collapsed into tears, her voice raw, torn open. "Silas, you can keep your treatment now." The name shivered through the room, no longer a whisper in secrecy, but a cry freed from fear. Her hands trembled, yet for the first time they opened. Not clenched, not hiding, but open, fragile, and released. The note she had slipped, the shame she had borne, found its answer in this moment. Jackson's stern face softened. His head bowed, once an acknowledgment not of guilt, but of promise. His gaze met hers, steady, affirming. The burden she had carried alone no longer belonged to her. The cafe watched hushed as a villain unraveled into a mother, as a mask dissolved into truth. Tears streaked her face, but there was relief now, not dread. What had been captivity had become deliverance. A single pair of hands, once condemned, now saved. For the listeners, the tight coil of anger loosened, replaced by a weight in the throat, a sympathy that burned deeper than rage. Jackson's voice carried again, but this time it was broader, louder, reaching everyone. From this day, the system changes. No one will be forced to wear cruelty as their mask. His words spread through the cafe like light-breaking dark glass. The employees drew sharp breaths, their bodies slackening as if chains had fallen away. One by one, the tension dissolved. Maeve pressed her hands to her face, tears escaping freely. At last. "Justice," she whispered, trembling with release. Eldon, who had watched quietly from the beginning, allowed a small smile to form his lined face, illuminated with vindication. Around them, a hush fell, not silence of fear, but of awe. Dorian stood, hunched his head, lowered, stripped of power, no defense left to summon. He was no longer the hand of control, only the image of defeat. The atmosphere transformed, the oppressive weight lifted, replaced by the fragile dawn of trust. What had begun as a bitter cup now ended as a vow spoken into walls that would never forget. There are hands, he thought, that have been forced into cruelty. Hands that strike not by choice but by command, bent into roles they never wished to play. And there are hands that seem dirty, hardened by anger, yet in truth they tremble in silence, begging to be seen. The thought stretched beyond the cafe, beyond this single night, touching the broader truth of lives pressed into corners. Jackson moved toward the door, each step steady measured. Behind him, the room remained hushed heavy with what had been uncovered. Yet beneath that stillness, something new flickered, fragile but real, the faint sense of light after long shadow. Chairs stayed empty, cups, unfinished eyes fixed on the man walking away. The cafe was no longer only a place of service, it had become witness court confession. And now, as the door inched open, the journey neared its close. A story that began in bitterness would end in reflection, carrying with it a message none present would forget. At the threshold, Jackson turned once more. His gaze sought Maribel, still rooted near the counter, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of release. His voice was firm, but softened at the edges. "Keep your hands clean. I will take care of the rest." The words reached her like a rope thrown across water. She nodded, tears streaming, clutching her apron with both hands, the fabric damp against her palms. What once had been fists clenched in anger were now open, shaking with relief. Forgiveness was not declared in speeches, but revealed in that nod, in the fragile gratitude of her body. Eldon leaned closer to no one in particular, whispering, "The last mask has fallen." His words lingered a quiet seal upon the moment. Jackson's eyes held hers one final time, then turned forward. What had begun as confrontation now closed with mercy, a hand extended rather than withdrawn. And in that exchange the story reached its truest resolution, the possibility of beginning again. Do not judge too quickly, for sometimes a trembling hand may hold within it the smallest ember of kindness, the spark that survives even in ruin. The thought rose like an echo, not his alone, but one carried by everyone who had seen the mask fall away. Words hovered in the air long after they were spoken, resonating beyond the cafe walls, beyond the night itself. The listeners carried them inward into memory, into conscience. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but reverence, the weight of a lesson etched deep. Time seemed to stretch each second heavier than the last, until the stillness itself became a kind of answer. Nothing more was needed. The story born in conflict now ended in reflection. Yet its voice lingered like the last note of a hymn vibrating softly in the chest long after the music had ceased. What remained was not anger, not pity, but an enduring understanding that even the harshest exterior may conceal a plea for mercy. Dorian's mask cracked. His voice faltered, words tripping over themselves. I was only following sales pressure." The excuse fell flat, an empty defense in a room already turned against him. Jackson's reply came cold, stripped of all mercy. "No, you were following greed." The words landed like stone, heavy, undeniable. The air thickened thick as tar, every ear straining to hear the collapse of a tyrant. No one spoke, no one moved. Maeve edged backward, unable to bear his gaze, her body shrinking under the weight of his downfall. Eldon pressed both hands against his cane, forcing himself to stand. His back straightened, and he gave a slow nod, silent but resolute, an old man's verdict laid bare. Around them, stillness deepened, charged with satisfaction. The audience of workers and patrons alike recognized the shift. Dorian's authority had drained, leaving only a trembling figure exposed under the harsh light of truth. Power no longer resided in him. It had bled away into the silence that judged harder than words. Jackson lifted the crumpled paper from his hand, raising it high enough for all to see. His voice carried. "Today I have seen the truth with my own hands." The note fluttered, slightly fragile, yet heavy as a verdict. Every eye turned toward it, the testimony written in trembling script. Maribel froze, terror rippling across her face. Tears broke free, sliding unchecked as though she feared the words would betray her further. Dorian paled, desperation seeping into his tone. "That is nothing but lies." But the claim was hollow. Maeve stepped forward, her voice small but clear. Steadying the silence, I heard everything. The statement cut sharper than any blade. The cafe shifted, the crowd no longer neutral. The room itself seemed to lean against Dorian, pressing in. The paper became more than paper. It was evidence, confession, survival, written in ink. Jackson held it firm, his hand steady, his eyes unflinching. What had begun as rumor was now truth in plain sight, impossible to bury. Jackson's gaze locked onto Dorian, unwavering. "You do not simply lose your position. You lose all trust." The words were iron final, carrying no offer of redemption. Dorian sagged under them, shoulders folding inward, his head bowing in surrender. His silence was louder than any protest a man stripped of the last defense he clung to. Shame clung to him like a second skin. Maribel's sob rose from the corner raw, almost childlike. "Thank you." The syllables cracked through the air, fragile and trembling, but enough to cut the weight of despair she had carried alone. Around her, faces turned away from Dorian, no ally left, no sympathy spared. The judgment was collective, silent, yet absolute. In that instant, the man who had commanded with fear stood abandoned, smaller than the workers he once crushed. The cafe itself seemed to exhale as if relieved of a burden. Retribution had come not in fury, but in clarity, and its mark was indelible. Jackson's eyes softened as they settled on Maribel. His voice, stripped of severity, carried a gentler weight. "What is your son's name?" The question broke through her defenses more sharply than any rebuke had. She hesitated, trembling before whispering Silas. The single word tremored in the air, fragile, sacred. Jackson inclined his head, voice steady, assured Silas will have his medicine. "And you will have work worthy of you." The promise landed with the force of redemption. Maribel's body folded inward as though the chains she had carried had finally snapped. She collapsed into her hands, sobbing openly, no longer able to wear the mask of defiance. Eldon reached across his old hand, resting lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that carried the wisdom of years and the compassion of one who had seen too much cruelty. Around them, the cafe watched in silence, their anger softening into understanding. For the first time, Maribel was not seen as villain or victim, but as a mother, vulnerable and whole. The silence broke not with clamor, but with a single voice. Maeve, who had cowered in shadows, lifted her head. Her words were fragile, yet they reached across the room. "We wanted to leave, too, but we couldn't. Thank you for seeing." The truth in her voice trembled, carrying years of unspoken pain. Jackson nodded, grave but resolute. "No one here will bow again." His words spread like warmth after frost, touching every listener with the promise of reprieve. A sound followed, low but unmistakable, a collective exhale, the long sigh of people released from an invisible grip. Shoulders dropped back, straightened eyes met without fear. For the first time, the cafe no longer resembled a prison. It breathed. The weight of silence shifted from oppression to relief. Those who had labored under fear found space enough to hope. Jackson's vow marked the storm's end, and in its wake came not noise but calm, the fragile calm of people learning how to stand free. Jackson turned, his voice expanding to fill the cafe with clarity and conviction. "From this day, no one will wear cruelty as a mask to feed their family." His words drew a line that none could mistake, a vow carved into the foundation of the place. Maribel lifted her head, her tears still wet, but her eyes alight with something new. Dignity restored, hope rekindled. Across the room, Eldon smiled faintly, a whisper leaving his lips. "This is justice." The simple phrase echoed with the gravity of truth. Around them, the air shifted as though shadows peeled away, replaced by light. What had once been a chamber of exploitation now seemed to awaken, reshaped by his declaration. No longer could the system remain untouched. Reform had been promised, and reform would come. The faces, once bowed, now rose, unmasked, their burdens eased. The last pretense had fallen. What remained was raw, unguarded humanity and the beginning of something better. Jackson reached into his jacket and laid a stack of bills on the table. The gesture was calm, deliberate, carrying no trace of pity. "This is not to buy silence," he said, his voice steady, but to begin again. The words carried more weight than the money itself, transforming currency into symbol. Maribel's eyes widened. She stared at the bills, then at him. Disbelief etched into every line of her face. Her lips parted, but no words came. The money was not charity. It was a promise, the first stone laid for rebuilding. Across the room, whispers stirred. He's really the CEO." The revelation spread like wind through dry grass. All eyes fixed on Jackson, their suspicion giving way to awe. Meanwhile, Dorian lowered his head, his shoulders slumped, retreating step by step toward the shadows stripped of command, swallowed by disgrace. The cafe shifted once more, its air thick with respect, the bitterness replaced by solemn recognition. Once a trembling hand had slipped him a secret, fragile and desperate. Now a steady hand returned justice, firm and certain. The symmetry sealed the story. Maribel opened her hands, no longer clenched in fear. They lay flat against her apron, empty but free of trembling, as though the chains that bound them had been cut. Jackson turned his steps, measured each one, carrying finality. The door loomed ahead, but he did not rush. Behind him, every gaze followed in silence, reverent, unwilling to break the stillness. The cafe held its breath, honoring the moment. The journey that began with insult now ended with solemn truth. The circle closed with hands as its center hands trembling, hands, steady hands, redeemed. He walked into the light, leaving behind not merely a room, but a lesson etched into those who had seen. Eldon leaned toward the man beside him, his voice rough yet steady. Never judge a hand until you know what it carries inside. The words quiet as they were spread through the stillness, stamping themselves into memory. Jackson was already gone, but his presence lingered woven into the silence. Yes, the thought resounded not as echo, but as truth affirmed. Around the cafe, no one spoke further. There was nothing left to add. The story had ended, yet its meaning hovered weighty and unshakable. The room did not need noise or closure. It needed only breath, soft, slow shared, before fading into ordinary time again. What remained was the moral clear as glass judgment without knowledge blinds, but understanding redeems. Perhaps you, too, have been misunderstood. Perhaps you have once slipped a secret into another's hand, hoping they would read beyond the surface, hoping they would see you as you are not, as the world demanded you to appear. The thought lingers slow and heavy, not accusing, not pleading, simply true. A call, quiet but insistent, for empathy. The story that unfolded here is not theirs alone. It is a mirror, and within it each listener may catch their own reflection, the harsh words spoken in fear, the mask worn to survive the tremor hidden inside a clenched fist. The cafe fades, the names dissolve, yet the feeling remains. A reminder that beneath every surface lies a depth unseen, and in that unseen depth rests the possibility of mercy. Do not rush to judgment. For sometimes the trembling hand extended in anger is not an enemy's hand, but a plea for help. And if you listen closely, if you pause long enough, you may find that by grasping it, you can save a life. The words fall soft, but their echo spreads wide, resonant as truth. Then silence follows, not empty, but full, a silence that carries what words cannot. The journey ends here, yet its breath lingers in the chest, warm and human. The anger is gone. The bitterness is gone. What remains is compassion. The simple truth that binds us we are fragile, and in our fragility lies our need for one another. The story closes, but its voice endures, an ember glowing quietly in the mind, waiting to be remembered when the next trembling hand reaches out.